All right, we are live on Instagram. We are live on YouTube. Welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show, brought to you by the Institute of Clinical Excellence. My name is Dustin Jones, one of the lead faculty within the older adult division. Today, we are talking about why and how making friends saves lives. Making friends saves lives. Before we get into the content, a couple quick announcements. MMOA, or Modern Management of the Older Adult. We are rocking and rolling, y'all. So our lives have started off super strong. We've got probably a course in your neck of the woods this year. We're going to be in a lot of new places in the next couple months through February. The 4th and 5th, we're going to be in Beaverton, Oregon, and then Choctaw, Oklahoma. The following weekend, the 11th and 12th, we're going to be in Maryland. And then February 18th and 19th, we're going to be in Kewanee, Illinois. So we're super pumped about all these lives. Check out ptonice.com to see if we're going to be in your neck of the woods. Our online courses are rocking and rolling right now. Our next cohort of online or MMOA Essential Foundations is going to be on March 1st. March 1st. All right, y'all. Making friends saves lives. I'm excited to talk about this topic because it's starting to become more clear to me of how impactful this is in a whole host of different outcomes, health outcomes, and even physical outcomes that we all care about, everyone that listens to the PT on Ice Daily Show. So I want to start off just by giving you some pretty interesting stats, maybe relatively scary to some extent, but these stats are related to the topic of social isolation. Social isolation. This is a big realm, especially in geriatrics and looking at how social isolation impacts older adults. And the stats are rather intimidating. 50% of community dwellings, so independent older adults, report either social isolation or loneliness. 50% of folks that are walking out in our community are going to report social isolation. Why is that a big deal? Why does that stat even matter? Because if you report on these reports that you are socially isolated, you have a 25% increased risk of all-cause mortality. So that's prematurely dying from all causes. That risk goes up by 25%. To compound that, if you are reporting that you are socially isolated and you are on that frailty spectrum, and if you've taken MMOA Essential Foundations or Live, you've learned about frailty and what that can look like clinically, you will also learn there's a lot of folks probably on your caseload, even for the outpatient folk, that are on that frailty spectrum. When you have that and social isolation on board, that even compounds that risk further. This is a scary issue, but there's something that we can do about it. And we're not often thinking about the factor of social isolation. This needs to be on our radar for good reason. So before we get into some of the more practical side of things, we need to kind of tease out the difference between social isolation and loneliness. Because when a lot of this research first started, it was all about social isolation. Social isolation, if you were to kind of read the definition, that's you having few social contacts and few relationships. So it's more of like a quantitative assessment. You are just not interacting with a lot of people and you don't have a lot of relationships. Well, as the research has continued to develop, that is a risk factor. That has a negative impact. But if you peel that onion a little bit, peel a layer off, what you're going to find out is that the bigger issue is not the number of social interactions and relationships that you have. It is the quality, the depth. And so what the research is kind of shifting to is looking at self-reported loneliness, of that being the bigger risk factor that could lead to some of these outcomes, like 25% risk with all-cause mortality. Loneliness is a sense of being alone and typically associated with fewer than desired social relationships. Now, what's interesting is that you can be socially isolated, but not be lonely. And you can not be social isolated, but feel lonely. It's interesting, right? I always think about, when I hear this topic, I think about the beginning of the pandemic. So think back, back to, March, April, May 2020, when the lockdown started to happen. And think about your experience with that. For some of you all, many of you all, that was a very difficult period because a lot of your social interactions, a lot of your relationships, the happy hours, going to the gym, whatnot, just completely halted and stopped, right? You took a lot of those to the Zoom game nights. Those were fun for maybe a couple times, and then you were over that, right? That was a very difficult time for you that drew a lot of your quality of life out of those deep social connections when those were kind of taken away from you. Now, on the other hand, there's a lot of you all that when those lockdowns happen, oh my gosh, thank the Lord. This is the best thing that could ever happen to me. For those of you that only need a few of those deep social relationships, more of the introverts, you freaking love that period of time, right? You had a great excuse to not have to interact with a lot of people. I know lots of my friends felt that manner, but then the opposite as well. I was more in the opposite camp where that was really difficult for me because I really thrive off of some of those relationships. But then I've got a lot of close friends, man. That was a really great time for them. So that take this to the context of many of our older adults. So we could have, let's say, folks in the home health setting who are by definition socially isolated, but they may still have a few of those deep, meaningful relationships where they don't feel lonely. This person is not as at risk of that increased risk of all-cause mortality as someone that's in the home health setting and they report that they're lonely. And then on the other end of things, we could have someone in something like a assisted living facility or an inpatient rehab facility where they have tons of interactions, where they're meeting all kinds of different folks, but none of those relationships have much depth, or they're not really building relationships, but just interacting with folks. Those people are not socially isolated per se, but they are lonely. And those people are at an increased risk of that elevated all-cause mortality. So all that to say, when we start to dive into the literature of social isolation, what we really need to think about is the loneliness side of things. So let's get into some of the practical parts of today's episode. The first one, in terms of what we can do about this, is it can be helpful to screen. There are some really good validated scales that just ask a few questions about loneliness, about reported loneliness. Kind of the gold standard that you're going to see is the UCLA loneliness scale. And I'm going to drop a link that's going to give you some really helpful information on all this stuff. I will drop in the comments of the Instagram post, and I'll throw it on YouTube as well. The UCLA loneliness scale is just 3 questions. Or statements, and you rate them on 0 to 4. 4 being strongly disagree, 0 being I strongly agree. I'll just read those out verbatim right now. I'm content with my friendships and relationships. Second one is I have enough people I feel comfortable asking for help at any time. Number 3 is my relationships are as satisfying as I would want them to be. And you rate that from a scale of 0 to 4. And you're going to get a good idea. There's some cutoffs there, some MCIDs that will be on that resource that I'll mention or that I'll link to. But this will give you a good idea if this person is indeed lonely. You don't want to assume based on the quantity of their social interactions that they are or are not lonely. But these questions can help you dig a little bit deeper. There's another one, De Jong Gierfeld loneliness scale that's been used in the literature a good bit. But from what I've gathered, the UCLA loneliness scale is kind of the gold standard for these self-report scales. So that's going to establish, does this person feel lonely? Do they have that feeling of loneliness? If they do, let's make some friends, because making friends can save lives. Now, when we get into trying to address this, obviously, we're only going to be able to influence so many of these factors, right? This is where we do what we can, but we need to be aware of where we can bring in the troops. What different services are available in your community to reach out to help connect them with resources, communities, whatever it may be. So some of these risk factors. The first one is in terms of the risk of loneliness. The risk factor is few social interactions. All right. So we already got that out the gate. If they are having fewer social interactions, they are at an increased risk of being lonely. What can we do to troubleshoot that? How can we connect them with communities, maybe with resources to be able to interact with more folks? That's the first one. Second one, psychological, depression, anxiety, cognitive decline, maybe something like dementia. How can we help medically manage and make sure that they're doing the things that they need to do, make sure the right healthcare providers know about their symptoms to help address some of those psychological barriers that could ultimately increase their social interactions and maybe develop higher quality interactions. 2, so that's 3. Third one is economics. So do they have the resources to be able to build some of these relationships? Number 4 is logistical, the transportation difficulties that many of our folks experience. Maybe it's a structural issue of not having a hand railing of some steps to get out of their home, something along those lines. So there's a big 4 we need to be aware of. We want to be able to refer and address with a lot of these. I highly recommend you connect with your local area agency on aging. Many of you all have a local area agency on aging that's going to be kind of the quarterback of a lot of the resources that are available to older adults in your community that you can refer to. All right, now the last one, this is the one I want to spend more time on, is the functional risk factor. If someone has impaired mobility, difficulty with transfers, also fear with their mobility, they are at a much higher risk of being lonely. And this is something that we want to think about. And I think it's very helpful to address the functional side of things when you grasp the concept of life space mobility. This concept, I've done an episode on this. This is probably a couple years ago at this point, but this is an area of research, typically in the realm of occupational therapy, where they're doing some very interesting data gathering with the use of wearables, phones, of being able to track where people are going about through their lives. And what they're finding is that if you are moving through a greater area, so your life space is bigger, you are much less likely to have a whole host of negative health outcomes. I mean, they are correlating big life space mobility to decreased risk of hospitalization, decreased number of falls. You're less likely to be admitted into acute care in general. You are likely going to be discharged from a hospital sooner if you have higher pre-space mobility beforehand. They're even predicting your functional ability in terms of gait speeds. So there's a whole host of negative health outcomes when your world is small. So think about your patient's life right now, especially for many of you all there in more acute settings, home health, skilled nursing facility, acute care, inpatient rehab. Some of your all's folks, their life space mobility may be 3 feet by 7 feet. It may be 21 square feet because they're spending their whole day and lives in their bed. The fact that you could give that person the ability to perform a transfer to get to a chair beside their bed, you functionally doubled their life space mobility. That is significant. And that could allow them to be able to interact more with people and build stronger relationships. Think about that person that is max assist to get out of the bed. If you are able to give the caregiver strategies, or maybe order a piece of equipment, or maybe reduce their need of assistance to get out of the bed into the chair, well, that chair, they're probably going to be able to get out the room and into the cafeteria, into the gym, into the social activities that may be at that facility. You have absolutely blown open the doors on their life space mobility. And I know for me, I used to think that was pretty insignificant. But now, after looking at this research of life space mobility and the detriment of being lonely and social isolation, that is a freaking huge win. So how can you increase people's life space mobility? Think about that. How can we connect with others? And we want to do this in a manner to where we're going to get them as strong as possible and improve their balance. And we're really trying to optimize their capacity. I think that's something that we all agree on, and something that we definitely preach at MMOA. But what I don't want you to neglect is the compensation piece. We often focus so much on trying to optimize physical capacity, and we often kind of throw shade on when we compensate, like when we say, hey, you'd probably do better off on that walker, or hey, I think that power lift chair may do you well. I used to hate on that stuff all the time, but there are situations where that's going to be super, super helpful, where that could increase their life space mobility to where they can build some of those stronger relationships that ultimately is going to lead to some more positive health outcomes. So the power lift chairs, what's another one? The stair roller coaster, the stair lift, right? Where you sit on, push the button and go down. Man, I used to hate on that crap all the time. We were taking away so many step ups and so much lower extremity strengthening. What if you gave that person the ability to actually exit their home and go to do meaningful activities with people that they care about? That's going to lead to a whole host of outcomes and likely increased physical activity. That's worth it. Yeah, let's put that stair lift in, right? Not all the time, but there are situations where we want to think about that. So we optimize, improve their capacity, improve their independence so we can increase their life space mobility. We also want to compensate for their deficits. We can use assistive device. We can get a lift chair. That is okay. We can get a stair lift as well in the right situation, where if we're able to increase their life space mobility, I think that's going to be a net positive. So we want to be very thoughtful about this. Social isolation versus loneliness. Dig a little bit deeper. Are they having those reports of loneliness? You have some scales to be able to measure that. Once you're able to identify, then we look at the risk factors. We have social risk factors, the few interactions like I mentioned, those psychological risk factors, typically maybe referring and connecting with other healthcare providers to make sure those are being managed well. Economic barriers. This is where local area agencies on aging, senior centers are going to be helpful. They may have some funding or resources available to that person. Logistical barriers are pretty huge. Lots of things we can troubleshoot there. And then the big dog that many of us are going to spend most of our time on, those functional barriers. Increase their capacity, optimize their capacity, but then also compensate when we want to or when we need to be able to increase their life space mobility. All right, let me know your thoughts on that. I'd love to hear your opinion. I'm going to drop the link to a really helpful resource that dives into this topic, but in a very succinct manner. It'll have links to those scales as well. I'll drop that on the Instagram post and the YouTube post as well. You have a lovely rest of your Wednesday, and hopefully we'll see you all out on the road at an ICE course or an MMOA course near you. See y'all.